What is going on, Battlefielders? Wally here with a bit of a video. This is another Twitter request coming in on Thursday. Now, the first request I did was from Fatal, and it asked me about what I think of the current teams in the marketplace and the landscape of Battlefield 4, and I talked a little bit about that. And unfortunately, right now, there's not a lot of teams to talk about because, well, the scene's kind of dead. That plays into a lot of respects with the current state of the game and so on and so forth, blah, 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 right? So that's fine. But I still think that the opinions I put in that video, again, are just opinions, but I think that they were as truthful as I could be. Now, the second one comes from Bacon, and he asked me basically it's not really a loaded question, but it's definitely a question that a lot of gamers will agree with, but a lot of people outside of the gaming atmosphere and the gaming environment will most likely disagree with. And it says, well, why do younger people play video games? Like specifically, not adults, like under 18, play video games, and why is violence in video games a factor in an aging child or something like that? And I did a speech on this in college about a year ago, and I did not get a good grade on the speech. And the main reason I didn't get a good grade on the speech wasn't because I didn't prepare, wasn't because I didn't know my source material, wasn't because I didn't put in the correct references or anything like that. It's because the teacher just didn't agree with my speech. And that is the risk you run with having a point of view that is different than the current media marketplace and media, what they spin out. And generally, most of the media, most of the conservative and some of the liberal media is pretty concerned that violence in video games is a factor in why people act the way they do. But if you look back from an historical standpoint, books were always around, movies were always around, and now video games is the new up-and-coming thing, and people always look for a scapegoat to blame. Now, I read a Harvard study based on video game violence and younger children playing video games, and the book was called Grand Theft Childhood. And the name in the book sounds deceiving. It sounds like it's going to be bad, but generally the study showed that violence in video games had positive effects more so than negative effects. Now, there still were cases where an oversaturation of lots and lots of violent video games had negative effects, where people would approach their problems with violence instead of diplomacy. But generally, video games teach us a few core things, mainly goal making and reaching and continuing to be stubborn to reach for those goals. The great thing about video games is that when you fail, you get an option to retry and retry and retry and retry and retry to an infinite degree, essentially. And the thing about life is that most successful people were not successful the first time they tried. I mean, I could just sit here and list you about 1,000 things that I thought that would be successful the first time I did them, and I'm still here doing the same thing, basically. I've changed a little bit here and there, but I'm doing the same thing. I still stream every day. I thought my stream would be super successful, and it's gotten a little bit more successful, sure. And I thought my YouTube would be super successful, and definitely it's pretty successful comparatively for what I do and how much effort I put into it. But generally, video games have taught me, and I think taught us, our generation and the upcoming generation, that working hard towards something means a lot more than just being given it. In video games, you have an option to change your difficulty slider, and you have the option to approach different situations. In life, you really don't have those options sometimes. You have an option to be diplomatic or not be diplomatic, but really there's no difficulty slider. You're just given a set hand and you have to play it. Now, if you're born in America or you're born in a modern first world country, generally you're given a much better chance at having a great life, a more successful life, because you have plenty of opportunities in comparison to a third world country or a developing country. Now, the idea with video games that frustrates me most is that with school shootings, and I know this is a touchy subject here, so let me be very, very politically correct. I do not agree with everything that is said, but of course, these events like Sandy Hook and Columbine are audacious. Nothing justifies them. Nothing. Not my argument. Not anyone saying that these kids were crazy. Nothing justifies the killings of innocent people who just don't deserve it, especially kids. But the idea to say that video games are responsible, that video games are the culprit because people are crazy, is ridiculous. It's absolutely insanity that people will just go ahead and blame one factor and say the reason they did this is because of this. They acted it out as if it were a video game, and they use that type of rhetoric to spin it, to give you the idea that, oh, it could be video games because they were acting out their favorite fantasies. Well, mean, what makes Game of Thrones any different? What makes watching a Rambo movie any different? Comparatively, video games are less violent and less gory on a general scale than most movies. I mean, look at the Game of Thrones episode where Auburn fought the Mountain. I mean, I don't even need to quote the end of that right there, but I've never seen that in a video game before, except for maybe like Fallout. But the idea is that video games and the entire media spectrum are not to blame, in my opinion, for what people do. They are, sure, in certain instances, again, an oversaturation of consistently being force-fed the same information where violence is the only answer, definitely. But most video games don't teach us that. Games like Mass Effect and Fallout teach us that diplomacy, talking to people, and getting through situations without violence is sometimes was a better option than fighting through it. The idea that video games are something that we should fight against, something that we should force ourselves to examine in a negative light, is terrible, because they offer us a fantasy world that we cannot live in. Currently, the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans are not fighting in World War III, but we get that opportunity to experience what that could be like in Battlefield 4. The idea that we may live in a universe with aliens and huge machines and awesome AIs and Mass Effect. We don't get that opportunity to live there. We're getting there, but currently, in our lifetimes, I don't think we'll see that, unfortunately. Ideas that we get to live in the past, but to re-experience World War II, fighting on the beaches of Omaha, not to the same degree, but getting a good idea of what those soldiers experienced on both sides, is something that we'll never have the chance to experience ourselves in the physical world. But in the virtual world, we get that opportunity. The idea that video games are some sort of negative culprit affecting children is a poor rationale to explain why people act the way they do. If people really wanted to blame anyone for the consumption of video games to a minor, they blame the parents. It's the consumer's fault. It's not the fault of the individual. It's not the fault of the developer. It's the fault of the parent. It's the fault of the guardian, the individual that's supposed to be there guiding them and telling them what is right and what is wrong. Obviously, if you give a game or a CD track, or if you show a child a track of NWA, of course they might have a bit of a reaction to it, especially younger minds. But the idea is that there's a reason there's a mature sign on the game or a teen sign on the game, because it tells you how old you're supposed to be to buy these games. It's not the fault of the developer or the environment in general, because a few parents can't read or don't want to spend the time to tell their kids that, look, this game is not something you want to play. You're 13 years old. Yeah, you probably shouldn't be playing Grand Theft Auto. That's an easy one. I think everyone can agree with that one. But what is the argument? You're going to say that Grand Theft Auto caused killings at Columbine and Sandy Hook? No, crazy people did that. Stupid people did that. Off the chain people did that. People that are despicable, horrible spectrums that are just wrong in every single way. Video games are not the reason for it. What the reason for it is, probably they're emotionally distressed. They don't know what's going on in their lives. They feel ostracized from the community at large. Their peers may not like them, whatever. There could be a plethora of reasons. But to make the sole factor in why violent individuals exist on video games is a horrible argument. It's a sweeping fallacy, essentially, that says, look, everything that has happened is because of these things, and it leads to one thing and another and another and another. Video games lead to violence and violent thoughts lead to hatred, and hatred leads to the dark side. And basically, we all know how that mantra goes. But basically, in the grand essence, you have to make the decision for yourself. Now, I think our generation is a little bit more informed. We don't consume as much cable media as our parents did. And I think that's one of our greatest strengths. The internet is an abundance of resources. It has knowledge from every single spectrum, and it gives you the opportunity to fact check, essentially. You can go back and forth and see, hey, this may not agree with this, and this may not agree with that. So when I did my study for my speech class, I basically did that. I went back and forth and found arguments for both sides, but generally the arguments for video game violence were written by parents, individuals who were not connected with the scene, who did not understand what video gaming is. It's an art source. It allows us to experience a world of fantasy. engage in individuals that aren't real, but allows us to live out our imaginations on a grand scale. And for that to be perversed into some ideal that video games and violence somehow correlate into shootings and mass murders is just despicable. It's a horrible concept, and hopefully in our lifetime we will see that kind of rhetoric die out. But that has been my opinion of video game violence and the issues surrounding it. If you agree or disagree, I'd like to know in the comments below. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, feel free to ask me. And of course, hit me up on Twitter next Thursday at 4 p.m. I will be releasing another tweet, and the first person to get to me, I will do a commentary video on their subject of choice. As always, I really appreciate everyone coming in here. Check out Bacon in the description. Check out his Twitter. He's also a streamer, so check him out. That will do it for me, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you guys enjoyed this a little rant, if you will, with maybe a little bit of education dropped in there with some opinion and, of course, great bias on my end. But as always, I love you guys, and I hope you guys have a great day. That will do it for me. Peace.